So, hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Sam Hirst, if any of you don't know me. And I designed this talk on 10 things you should know before you read the Bronte Juvenilia for the course that I'm running at the moment at the Bronte Parsonage. But I wanted to make it publicly available because I think it could be useful to anybody who is trying to encounter the Bronte Juvenilia for the first time. It can be quite difficult to get into. There is a lot of it. There's reams and reams by Branwell, reams and reams by Charlotte, and the opposite problem with Anne and Emily, where very little of what they wrote remains. So it can be quite daunting how much there is. And it can also be quite difficult to pass what's going on. Not all of the Juvenilia is very widely available, although it has mostly been published. But in terms of copies that everybody can have access to, it's still quite limited. One of the best that I always recommend is the one edited by Christine Alexander, which is Tales of Glasstown, Angria, and Gondal. And it's got a selection of the work of each of the siblings, so it can be quite helpful. But it also demonstrates the problem for people who are just trying to encounter the Juvenilia for themselves, that it takes stories from different time periods and puts them together. But of course, there's hundreds of pieces of work that it doesn't include, that it can't include because it would just be too massive. And so you can find yourself getting a little bit lost trying to work out, well, what type of writing is this? Why does this tell the same story, but it's making very different claims about what happened? And it can be a little bit disorienting, even with the excellent notes that that edition has. So this is a very easy guide to try and help people start to read the Juvenilia and some things to have in mind. So the first thing to know about the Juvenilia is that it started out as child's play, quite literally. We've got at least a year or two when the siblings were playing with toys, making up these ideas and games and acting them out for themselves before anybody started writing anything down. And it's Charlotte and Branwell that start writing in about 1829, 1830. We have in one of Charlotte's earliest pieces, A History of the Year, an account of this play and how it all began, the very famous 12 soldiers that Branwell was given by his father. So this is the account that Charlotte gives us. Papa brought Branwell some soldiers at Leeds, and when Papa came home, it was night and we were in bed. So next morning, Branwell came to our door with a box of soldiers. Emily and I jumped out of bed, and I snatched up one and exclaimed, "This is the Duke of Wellington, it shall be mine." When I said this, Emily likewise took one and said it should be hers. And when Anne came down, she took one also. Mine was the prettiest of the whole and perfect in every part. Emily's was a grave looking fellow. We called him Gravy. And Anne's was a queer little thing, very much like herself. He was called Waiting Boy, and Bramwell chose Bonaparte. So we have this very neat origin story about these soldiers. There are other origin stories, other ways of telling the story, but this is the kind of basics. This group of siblings playing and making up stories for these toys. Now, it's worth noting that there was more than one play. So that's my second point. The one that we're probably most familiar with, the one that they extended out the most, is the young men's play, that play about the 12 soldiers. But there were also other ones, including The Tale of the Islanders and The Odeas. So the Islanders, as Charlotte tells us in History of the Year, the origin of the Islanders was as follows. It was one wet night in December. We were all sitting round the fire and had been silent some time. And at last I said, suppose we each had an island of our own. Branwell chose the Isle of Man, Emily Isle of Arran and Bute Isle, Anne Jersey, and I chose the Isle of Wight. We then chose who should live in our islands. Now, again, Charlotte, a couple of months later, writes a slightly more detailed and slightly different version of this story, but we have the basic idea. The story of the Islanders went on for quite a while, and Charlotte does write quite a lot about the Islanders. There's 4 volumes of tales of the Islanders that she writes. But eventually that Islanders story kind of gets subsumed into the young men's play. So they share characters in common. And then eventually the Islanders kind of peters out. The Odeas was another story, but there's nothing really that remains of the Odeas, or there's very little. The story started, according to Charlotte, in this way. We pretended we had a large island inhabited by people 6 miles high, the people who we took out of Aesop's fables. Hayman was my chief man, Boaster Bramwell's, Hunter Anne's, and Clown Emily's. Our chief men were 10 miles high, except Emily's, who was only 4. Now you might be thinking, Sam has made a classic typo here. No, the word chief is usually spelled by the Bronte siblings as children in this manner, Cheif. So there was more than one play. So it can be a bit confusing if you suddenly read one of the Tale of the Islanders and like, wait, what's going on? How does this relate to the rest of it? Imagine it as a sort of slightly separate tale off to one side, and it's a little bit easier to cope with, even though there are characters in common. Of course, another important thing to note is that after a while, Emily and Anne kind of broke away and created their own world, separate from, although vaguely connected to, the world that their older siblings had mostly been in charge of. So they created the world of Angry and Gondel in about 1831. And it's a bit of a mystery. There's not much that remains of Gondel. We know that Anne and Emily wrote more, but what remains for us are some diary papers that Emily and Anne wrote. They did this thing every few years where they would write sort of a letter to their future selves, which would detail, what was going on at the time and what they thought might go on in the future. And these letters include, or these diary papers include, some details about their Gondel saga. And we also have some of the poetry that they wrote in and about the world. But, lots of different scholars have tried to piece together what happened, who the characters are, how we can identify them, because often only initials are used. But there isn't sort of a single solid answer to that. So if you're reading the Gondel poems, like finding yourself trying to track what's happened, don't worry. You probably won't get a solid answer because nobody has yet. So the young men's story that I mentioned as the main one becomes the Glass Town story and then the Angrian saga. So these are the terms that you might be familiar with. This is the world that most people think of when they think of the Bronte's Juvenilia. So in the story, original young men's story, we have 12 sailors arriving in Africa. And four of these sailors are the soldiers that kind of each of the siblings chose. But some changes have happened. So instead of having Wellington, Napoleon, Gravy, and Waiting Boy, we've got Wellington still, but Branwell has become Sneaky. We've got Ross and Parry for Emily and Anne, and Ross and Parry were two Arctic explorers that they clearly into, that they took the names and made them four of these soldiers, for soldier sailors. So in this story, those 12 soldiers are on this boat. They end up in Africa after various storms and tribulations. And eventually Wellington becomes their leader as they build a new world for themselves after massacring many of the native inhabitants. So they set up what is first called, well, actually it's called Twelve's Town, but Twelve's Town eventually kind of gets burnt down or gets destroyed. So we have Glass Town as the first major town. It's later renamed Variopolis and then Verdopolis. And finally, after sort of a number of years, a number of wars and rebellions within Glasstown and its provinces, a kingdom is separated off and given to a key character called Zamorna, and this kingdom is Angria. So that's where we get the idea of the Angrian saga. So as you're reading, if you try and read in order, or if you're kind of reading stories in and out, you might find yourself at different points of this transition, when it's still Glasstown, when it's already Verdopolis, when we've got Angria existing. But these are all connected, but if you imagine that timeline, that can be quite helpful. Something to think about in terms of trying to read and pass the Juvenilia is that the siblings didn't always agree. We saw in the last slide that there's these evolutions where Glasstown becomes Verdopolis, and then we get the evolution of Angria. And we're going to see that quite often. We're going to see lots of stories that change, that go back on themselves, where we're going to get different versions. Even the very kind of first story about this world, the origin story of the young men, we get different versions in the History of the Year by Charlotte in 1829 and in the History of the Young Men by Bramwell. So they overlap, but they tell different stories of this history. Part of that is about what they're both interested in. So Bramwell loves stories of war, and he gives us lots and lots of war details, but he also gives us this different history of the place. So it means that as readers, it can be really difficult to try and get a grip on what is happening, because the siblings can tell different stories about the same events or the same people. Imagine this. That's why I started off with this idea that this is child's play. So imagine this starting off really as that kind of really interactive playfulness where you can reset the story, go again, change the outcome, change the way it's being told. And we get different versions of the same events by different writers. Now, by different writers, I do mean Charlotte and Branwell. They're still the two that are doing most of the writing. They might give different accounts, but also in the world, they take on different writing personas, such as John Budd, that you can see here on the slide, a pseudonym for, or a persona for Branwell, and Captain Tree or Charles Wellesley for Charlotte. And their characters in the world will write different versions of the same story. So it can get very confusing. We also have different mechanisms to reset the story often. So characters are killed off and then frequently resurrected. Sometimes this happens within the story, as we see, for example, in The Foundling by Charlotte, where a character is killed at the end and brought back at the end. We even see it in the 12, in the sort of history of the young men, that first story where various of the characters die and are brought back and die and are brought back. The kind of really major example of this later is the death of a character called Mary Percy, which Branwell and Charlotte disagree on. Branwell killed her off and Charlotte didn't want her to die. So, you can get real dissension between the siblings about these deaths. So what's worth bearing in mind is that what this means is that stories change, characters change, and there can be more than one version of the same history occurring. Very difficult as readers, or very fun as readers, depending on your position. So number 6, I've already mentioned this a little bit, but it's worth taking note of, that the siblings take on different personae in their worlds. So they're not just the authors, they actually take a role. In the Tales of the Islanders that I mentioned earlier, the siblings play the little kings and queens who often have authority over the text to come in and sort of sort out all the problems. In the story of the 12s, or the story of the young men, they are the genii. Now, the genii don't exist throughout the whole of the Glasstown and Angrian sagas, or they're not kind of prominent, but they are very prominent in the early work and up into the early 1830s when the siblings were writing. Each of the siblings had a genie kind of character or persona. Branny was Branwell, Tally was Charlotte, Annie was Anne, and Emmy was Emily. It's not a difficult code to unlock. And they would then be able to do all sorts of things within the story: appear, move people across massive distances, resurrect people. They would come in and advise or tell their characters what to do. In one memorable episode, one of them sort of picks up one of the characters who's having a crisis, thinking, wait, do I exist? Am I just a character in somebody else's story? And then a giant hand kind of picks him up. So you do get them interacting in the story in quite active ways. There's also more mundane personae that they take on within the world of the stories. So they take on different characters who write stories within Angria. So we've got people like Charles Wellesley and Captain Tree, a persona for Charlotte, and Captain Budd's death, and sometimes even Northumberland are sort of personae for Branwell. Now, I'll tell you more about Northumberland's death in a minute, but the other figures are sort of literary and writing figures predominantly within this world. And these figures not only sort of tell different stories, but they also will actively sort of interact with each other, disagree with each other, make fun of each other. And we see sort of the siblings critiquing each other's work, or sort of in dialogue with each other about their work, through these characters that they kind of speak through. I've popped it in the picture there, an example of The Poetaster, which is a play by one of the characters, by one of Charlotte's kind of personae, having a go at one of Branwell's, one of his poets, Young Salt. So it's quite fun, it's quite dialectic, but it can be quite confusing as these different characters are taking on different aspects of the identity of their writers and interacting with each other in really complex and interesting ways. Having said that, one of the things that's really notable about the Juvenilia and quite important to it is that the siblings created a whole literary world within their juvenilia worlds, within their paracosmic worlds. And this means that they, it shows an early interest, at least for Charlotte and Branwell, in the publishing industry, in the way of being writers. And they were particularly interested in and inspired by magazine culture, specifically Blackwell magazine, Blackwood's magazine, sorry, which is a magazine from a Scottish magazine, and I've got it Blackwell on my text, but it's Blackwood's. So Branwell Blackwood's magazine. Apologies there, guys. They're inspired by a real life magazine called Blackwood's. And originally Branwell sets it up. He's kind of the one in charge. He calls it Branwell's Blackwell magazine. He runs it for about 6 months, and then he hands it on to Charlotte. It becomes the Blackwood's Young Men's Magazine, and then the Young Men's Magazine. And it's modeled very much on the form of the real Blackwood's. So it includes lots of different types of writing, from poems, stories, advertisements, and what are called the Nights, sort of inspired by the Noctes Ambrosianae in the Blackwood's magazine. And in the Nights, it's kind of like live dialogues. Different characters within the world, including the personae of the authors, chat to each other, discuss philosophical and political questions. So it's a really interesting magazine in and of itself, but what you get between editions is the different writers kind of speaking back to each other, putting in advertisements and critiques, and sort of responding to each other in lots of different ways. It's worth noting that some of the major characters are poets, and so we do have a lot of poetry being written as well in the Juvenilia. People often think, I think, for Charlotte and Branwell at least, they think about prose, they think about story writing, but there's lots and lots of poetry, particularly by Branwell. He does a lot of poetry in the Juvenilia. But they're also producing all kinds of other writing within this magazine context: poetry, articles, stories, plays, reviews, all sorts of different things are happening. So let's get back to kind of the broader world outside of this literary aspect of it. So within the Juvenilia, the siblings have characters who are sort of considered theirs. Now, their other sibling might write about them, but this is a character that they are mostly responsible for or mostly engaged with, at least early on. Later on, we'll see, as Branwell and Charlotte increasingly kind of diverge or work separately later on, that Charlotte takes the stories of her characters Amorna and Branwell's character Northanglan and kind of runs with them herself in different ways. So we've got, originally we had those initial soldiers, the 4 soldiers, each of which was associated with one of the siblings. So Wellington, Napoleon, who became sneaky, Ross and Parry. And each of the siblings was responsible for their storytelling and also kind of responsible for their welfare. So often the genie would come in and rescue their character or advise their character. Also, the initial soldiers, all the 12, ended up having their own lands, their own region. And the 4 soldiers here, their lands, they would become king of, or the ruler of their land. And then that would be the responsibility of the sibling that was responsible for that character. So we've got a really good example in one of the later magazines of a Charlotte character making fun of Parry's land. So she's kind of critiquing Emily and Anne for making worlds that are just too boring, too mundane. We also have these kind of 2 really central figures to the Juvenilia saga, Zamorna and Northangland. I've spelt that wrong, but it's Northangland. And Zamorna is Charlotte's character, and Northangland is Branwell's character. And I usually refer to them by these names because those are their kind of final names that appear in a lot of stories, but it's a bit more complicated than that, and they do have different names through the Juvenilia. Don't worry, I'll get back to that point. So the key rivalry at the heart of the Glasstown saga is Zamorna versus Northangland. There's lots of other characters and there's lots of other rivalries. There's different routes that you can go down in investigating the Juvenilia. But I often find that trying to follow Zamorna and Northangland can be a way of, at least for the first time of reading, navigating your way through, because they are so central to so many stories. Now, Zamorna was originally the son of the Duke of Wellington. What I say to my students quite often is that there is, like, it's useful to think of two generations in this young men's tale. We have the original 12 soldiers, but they become kind of the rulers, the patriarchs, and slowly kind of disappear off page a little bit, including Wellington. What we've got happening is that the siblings took these real life characters and then they got a bit constrained by them. So the next generation, they have a bit more control over, they design more fully their personalities, etc. So Zamorna is originally, he's the son of Wellington, he's Arthur Wellesley. So that is actually, named after the Duke of Wellington's son. And he becomes then the Marquis of Douro. Again, that's the actual title of the real life person as well. But Charlotte is very much building a character here, a very Byronic character. When he's the Marquis of Douro, he's sort of an aristocrat, a poet, a politician. Later on, he becomes the Duke of Zamorna and then the King of Angria. And he becomes more of a politician and war leader and eventually something of a tyrant. What's worth noting is that it's not just that the names change, it's also that we see Charlotte very much developing this character of Zamorna in a lot of different ways, but becoming perhaps more cynical about him as she goes, although she's always been quite cynical. In terms of Branwell's key character, we've got Northumberland. So he enters the stories as Rogue, often spelt Rouge by Branwell. And he is often involved in shenanigans, in crimes, from piracy to sort of cattle stealing. He becomes Alexander Percy, so is the other name for the character. And then he marries Lady Zenobia Elrington and becomes himself Lord Elrington. So he becomes this aristocratic figure, but he still maintains that rebelliousness and he's responsible for, well, most of the wars that happen in the Glasstown and Angrian sagas as he leads or foments rebellions and sort of all sorts of military actions and revolts. Eventually, he becomes known as Northumberland, and he's consistently in this enemies, rivals, also close friends situation with Zamorna, where they're often at odds, including fighting against each other, but they also have a strange connection. Part of the connection is that Zamorna is married to Northumberland's daughter, and so he treats him as his father-in-law as well as his political enemy. But their relationship is complicated and intriguing, and it's a really fun thing to dive into if you're into the Juvenilia. So also, we can use Zamorna and Northumberland to map some key relationships and characters in Glasstown and Angria. So they become an easy way into quite a lot of the stories and quite a lot of the interconnected narratives that are happening. So Zamorna, his father was the Duke of Wellington, as I mentioned. So we're going to get a lot of stories where the Duke of Wellington appears at some point. His brother is Charles Wellesley, who starts off as this kind of aristocratic writer and darling of society and changes over time to become the kind of jobbing writer Charles Townshend, separated from his family almost entirely. But he is consistently a writing character, and he's one of the chief personae that Charlotte takes on. Zamorna is married multiple times to Helen Gordon, and then most notably Marion Hume, about whom multiple stories are written, and also Mary Percy, who's the daughter of Northumberland. Mary Percy is that character that I mentioned gets killed off by Branwell, that Charlotte was like, absolutely not, no. So these marriages, these romances, these dissensions between them become kind of key to a lot of the stories. Key also to a number of the stories are Zamorna's lovers, of which there are many, including Mina Lowry, Cephala, Rosamond Wellesley, and Caroline Vernon. As I said in the class, for those of you who are in the class with me at the parsonage, the ones that we're going to be thinking about in this course are Mina Lowry and Caroline Vernon. The first is a sort of lower class woman who is absolutely devoted to Zamorna's interests, to her own detriment often. And Caroline Vernon is Zamorna's ward, the illegitimate daughter of Northumberland, who Zamorna will seduce and be critiqued for seducing by Charlotte. So Northumberland also had multiple marriages, which gets us into lots of different stories. So the first was Augusta de Segovia when he was living in foreign lands, so not the worlds of Glasstown and Angria, and she dies of poison. He then has this kind of quite settled life with Maria Henriette Wharton, but that doesn't last. She dies, and he has a very odd relationship to the children that he had with her. So his daughter Mary Percy, as we know, marries Zamorna, but he completely disowns his sons as children. They have to kind of find their own way in the world. His third marriage is to Zenobia Elwington, a blue stocking and kind of very interesting and complex character, a very knowledgeable and learned character as well, who had been in love with Zamorna but had been scorned by him, marries Northumberland, and it's a very difficult relationship for most of their time together. Northumberland also has a variety of lovers. Particularly relevant in the context of their rivalry is Louisa Vernon, who is the mother of Caroline Vernon. He also has a number of allies at different points in his life, some of them for his criminal and more dubious shenanigans, like Naughty and's death. So his death is his servant or factotum, but also is the persona of the chief genie Branny. So he's a persona of Branwell. He's also got sort of foreign allies like Montmorency, who's French, and Quashiaquamina, who is the native character who leads one of the rebellions against the Glasstown and Angrian people. His arch rival, of course, is Zamorna, but he also hates his sons, so I wanted to put them in here as well. So as you can see, even with this kind of brief introduction, we're already getting into how complicated and loaded and in-depth the Juvenilia is. There are sort of hundreds of characters, there's hundreds of works, there's lots and lots of different stories, some of which stack up neatly and tell a long narrative across multiple stories, some of which seem to be completely backtracking and going against each other. So this is going to help you find a path through, but it won't answer all of your questions as you're reading. And I just want to give a caveat at the end, a bonus point, an extra one, is that although I've concentrated on Zamorna and Northumberland here, by doing so, we only get a partial picture. If we focus on only one storyline or character or put them at the center of the narrative, we're not going to see a lot of the Juvenilia because there's just so much. I haven't even mentioned characters like Henry Hastings or Elizabeth Hastings, who play a large role. I've not gone into what's going on with the trees and buds of the world. But there is a lot more that you can dive into, a lot of other threads that you can follow through if you want to. One of the things I consistently see with kind of the popular imagination around Glasstown and Angria is this flattening, this simplification, this idea that there is this one story and we can follow it all the way through, but it's just not true, guys. If you're encountering the Juvenilia, you've just got to let go a little bit, fall into it, and have fun exploring this magical world that the siblings created. I hope this was helpful, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from my students this week. And if any of you are watching this and aren't my students, feel free to share in the comments your own experiences of reading the Juvenilia. I'm always happy to hear from people and answer questions as well. See you later, everyone. Bye.